Back in the 60s, there was this article in the Harvard Business Review where this business professor talked about what he coined market myopia. And what this kind of concept was, he described this as the phenomenon that happens when a business loses sight of why they do what they do. A business starts to focus so much on what they do that they forget why they do that thing in the first place. And the argument goes that when businesses start to do this, that's when they start to decline and they will ultimately die. And so kind of the famous example he used back in the 60s in this article was the railroad industry. And so he kind of talks about if you step back and look and say, well, what does the railroad industry do? And the answer is, well, they manage trains and railroads. But if you ask, why does the railroad industry do that? The answer would be, well, they do that to more conveniently transport people from point A to point B. But what he argued is that as all this new technology started being developed, like cars and airplanes, the railroad industry forgot why they did what they did. They said, well, we just manage trains, we manage railroads. And if they had remembered why they did that to more conveniently transport people, they would have begun to shift and they would have invested in automobiles and airplanes, but they didn't. And so those industries ultimately ended up taking over the railroad industry. So that's kind of how he describes this phenomenon. So I think the most kind of recent big example of this would be Blockbuster. Right, Blockbuster Video. Now, those of you who are like too young to where you never went to a Blockbuster, all this is going to sound like some weird urban legend from a faraway land. Like it's just going to sound crazy to you. But back in the day, right, if you wanted to watch a movie, you would have to get in a car, you would drive to a shopping center, and like in between the grocery store, a pet store, and a Chinese takeout restaurant, there was this place called Blockbuster. And inside Blockbuster, there were literally thousands of physical copies of movies. And so you would walk in and you would spend like 30 minutes walking around the store, because that's part of the experience, right? It's a whole deal. You would walk around the store and you couldn't watch the trailers for the movie, so you didn't really know if they'd be good or not, but you would pick up these little boxes, you would turn them over, and you would look at a couple pictures and you would read the descriptions. And if you decided on that movie, you'd take it up to the front, pay for it, and you would take it home, and that was the movie you were going to watch that weekend. And if like 10 minutes in, the movie was awful and you were bored, you're out of luck. Because like your mom's not getting you back in the car to drive you all the way back out to Blockbuster. Like you just got to deal with it and watch the movie. But man, like if you're around my age, like was there anything better than a Friday night, your parents let a friend sleep over, you go to Blockbuster, you rent Happy Gilmore, you get the stuffed crust pizza from Pizza Hut, a 2-liter of Surge, right? Like if you're my age, like that was the ideal Friday night. If that was happening, like it was going to be a good night. But that was Blockbuster. And so they had brick and mortar stores that they rented videos from. That's what they did. They managed these brick and mortar locations where they rented videos. But then this little startup company called Netflix came along. And again, if you're young enough, this is going to sound weird to you as well. But before streaming became a thing, what Netflix would do is you would go to their website, you would pick what movies you wanted to rent, and then a few days later, they would send you the DVD in a little red envelope in the mail. Like even now, that's not that long ago, but even now, that sounds insane, right? Like that's crazy. But that's what Netflix did. They would deliver movies to your mailbox. And then, of course, as kind of technology developed and streaming became possible, now Netflix just streams everything. And almost every house in America has a Netflix account, or at least you've got your brother-in-law's password and you steal a Netflix account. Like we all use it, right? But here's the fascinating thing about Blockbuster and Netflix. Blockbuster actually had multiple opportunities to acquire Netflix for next to nothing. They had the chance to buy out Blockbuster for almost nothing, but they didn't do it. And the reason they didn't do it is because they didn't believe Netflix was their competitor. Right? Blockbuster said, well, they're like an online retailer. We are a brick and mortar retailer. And so like our paths are never going to cross. Like we are in completely different businesses. And so what happened was Blockbuster was so fixated on what they did, like managing brick and mortar stores, they forgot why they did it, to more conveniently deliver entertainment to their customers. And if they had remembered why they did what they did, then when Netflix came along, the people at Blockbuster would have said, hey, maybe this is a more convenient way to do what we do. So let's make a shift and go in this direction. But they didn't do it, and they died. But here's what's interesting. This concept that was written about, 80 years ago, market myopia, I don't think this is something that just happens in the world of business. I think this is something that happens in the local church as well. If we're not careful, as a family, as a church, we will become so fixated and so focused on what we do instead of why we do what we do. And we've been, if you're new with us, we've been kind of walking through the book of Acts over the last several months. And the book of Acts actually kind of reorients our mind, and it reminds us why, as a church, we do what we do. So if you're new, I'll give you a little review to kind of catch you up to speed. After Jesus' death and resurrection, he calls his followers to kind of come together for this one last meeting. He's going to give them kind of one last charge. He brings them in. And he says, hey guys, I'm going to get ready to leave. I'm going to ascend to heaven where I'm going to sit at the right hand of the Father, of God the Father, until I return once again. And Jesus tells his followers, he says, but until then, until I return, go and make disciples of people from all nations. Right? He tells his people, says, what I want you to do is I want you to go all around the world. Go find people who don't know me. Go find people who haven't yet been told about my death and resurrection. Go find people who are in spiritual darkness, who are spiritually lost, and share with them the hope and the grace and the love that God the Father offers them. So that's Jesus' last final charge to his followers, to his disciples. That's in Acts 1. But then what we see immediately after that, after Jesus gives what is called the Great Commission there, immediately after Jesus gives the Great Commission, in Acts 2, we see the church being born. We see the birth of the church. Right? And so we see clearly in Acts that the Great Commission, that charge to go and make disciples, that is the mission of the church. We see clearly in Acts that is why the church exists. Jesus gives the mission, says go and make disciples, that's the mission. He gives the mission, and then immediately the Spirit gives birth to the church so that the church can be the vehicle by which that mission is accomplished. And so what that reminds us of is that as a local church and corporately all around the world as the capital C global church, the church doesn't exist to do worship services on Sundays. The church doesn't exist to have small groups or Sunday school classes. The church doesn't exist to have private schools. The church doesn't exist to run a food bank. Although all those things are great things. Like I am 1,000% for all of those things. All of those things are great. It's just we see in Acts that none of those things are primarily why the church was born. None of those things are why the church exists. We see so clearly the church exists to go and make disciples. That's it. That's the mission of the church. But again, this whole concept of market myopia, we can forget the why, go and make disciples, and focus so heavily on the what, like worship services, small groups, Sunday school, all those things. And so how do we know if we are getting sidetracked or not? How do we know if we are remembering the why as a community, as a family, as a local church? And I think Acts chapter 13, the church at Antioch, shows us this huge marker of a church that is remembering the why, this huge marker of a church that remembers the mission. And I'll go and give it to you. If you're taking notes, you can write this down, and then we'll read the passage. But what we're about to see here is that a church that remembers the mission will sacrifice what's best for themselves for the sake of the lost. And this is important. A church that remembers the mission, or a church that remembers the why, that remembers why we even exist in the first place, a church that remembers that is going to be filled with people who will always be willing to sacrifice what's best for themselves for the sake of the lost, for the sake of those who don't yet know Christ. So let's look at this in Acts 13, verse 1. It It says, among the prophets and teachers at the church of Antioch of Syria were Barnabas, Simeon called the Black Man, Lucius from Cyrene, Manaen, the childhood companion of King Herod Antipas, and Saul. One day as these men were worshiping the Lord and fasting, the Holy Spirit said, appoint Barnabas and Saul for the special work to which I have called them. So after more fasting and prayer, the men laid their hands on them and sent them on their way. So such a simple, short passage, but we see something so profound happening in there. So first of all, as a reminder, we saw the birth of this church in the city of Antioch in chapter 11. And as we saw, this was the first multi-ethnic church in all the world. This was the first time that both Jew and Gentile were coming together. In this church, all of the social barriers that society had raised were being broken down because of the gospel. I mean, we even see this in the description of the leaders of the church. You've got Jew and Gentile, right? You've got Greek, you've got Middle Eastern from Israel, you've got a guy from Northern Africa, you've got another guy from Southern Africa. Within the leadership of this church is this great diversity of people because the good news of Jesus is breaking down all of those dividing walls that society and culture had built up. But what happened, we saw back in chapter 11 a couple weeks ago, as this church is born, the church in Jerusalem sends this guy Barnabas to Antioch to help lead the church. And if you remember, when Barnabas got to Antioch, what he did is he kind of looked around, he surveyed the situation, and he said, hey, there's this other guy over in Tarsus, this guy Saul, and I believe Saul, also known as Paul, I think he has a lot to offer to this church. So Barnabas went to Tarsus, he got Paul, he brought Paul back to Antioch, and for the last year, Paul and Barnabas had been leading this church. Right, when we get to chapter 13, for the previous year, Paul and Barnabas are pastoring this church. And so on this particular day, Paul and Barnabas and the other leaders that they've kind of trained and raised up in this church, they're getting together, they're spending time worshiping, and they're spending time praying and fasting, seeking God's will. And as they do this, God speaks to them. God reveals something to them. God says, hey, there is this special assignment, there's this special task that I need Paul and Barnabas to go do. As we'll see as we get into the rest of the chapter next week, this special task was for Paul and Barnabas to go travel overseas, taking the good news of Jesus, taking the gospel to people who had not yet heard it. And that's the task that God has called them to. But notice here, when God calls Paul and Barnabas to this special task, what happens is that the church lays their hands on them, they pray for them, and they immediately send them on their way. Now again, what we are seeing here, what is happening in these 3 short verses, is that we are seeing this church remembering the mission. They understand why they exist, to make disciples, and because of that, they are sacrificing what's best for themselves for the sake of those who have not yet heard the gospel. All right, think about how we're seeing this in this passage. Paul and Barnabas are the 2 main leaders of the church of Antioch. All right, so they're the 2 main pastors. They're the 2 lead guys. And who are Paul and Barnabas? All right, Paul, first of all, he's a stinking apostle, man. He's like top of the line, like top of the food chain. He experienced the resurrected, living Jesus face to face. And Paul was the guy who would go on to write the book of Romans, which is arguably like the most important theological work ever written across all faiths in human history. Like Paul is debatably, like not only from a religious standpoint, from a secular standpoint, Paul is debatably the most brilliant theological mind that has ever walked this planet. Right? Paul is a genius, and he's their pastor. Like he's the one who teaches them week in and week out. And Barnabas, this other one, the text tells us that Barnabas' nickname was the son of encouragement. So Barnabas is like the most encouraging guy you've ever met. He's the guy who you can't be around for 5 minutes without leaving just like built up and feeling loved and feeling valued and feeling encouraged. That's who Barnabas was. So their 2 leaders, right? Their 2 pastors are 1, the most brilliant theological mind to ever walk this planet, and 2, the most encouraging man to ever walk this planet. So, if you're a member of the Church of Antioch, and those are your two leaders, do you think it would be hard to send them off? Of course it would. Right? Do you think it would be difficult to send them on the way and say, hey, God is calling you to something new. He's calling you to something else. Let me pray for you and let me send you on your way. Absolutely, it would have been hard. And Paul and Barnabas leaving the church of Antioch for this new mission that God had called them to, this would have been so difficult for the people of this church because they loved Paul, they loved Barnabas, and this church was served so well by these men. They were the best the church had. They were the A team. But notice here, as soon as God says, hey, I've got a new assignment, I have this special calling for Paul and Barnabas. There's other people around the world who have not heard about Jesus, and they need to hear. When God says that, the church doesn't say, no, God, can we kind of debate? Can we make a trade here? Can we keep Paul and Barnabas and maybe send you a couple of the people in the congregation that, kind of get on our nerves that we're not too fond of? Like, can we send somebody else? We really want to keep Paul and Barnabas for ourselves. They don't do that. As soon as God calls them, the congregation lays hands on them and sends them out. These are a people who they're not thinking about what's best for them. The people in Antioch, they're not thinking about their own needs. They're not thinking about their own preferences. They're not thinking about what's in it for them. They're thinking about what is best for the lost. What is best for those who have not yet heard the name of Jesus. So because of that, they lay their hands on them, they pray, and they say, get out. You got to go. Get with it. And they send them on mission. And again, we're seeing here so clearly that a church that remembers the mission, it's going to be filled with people who always are willing to sacrifice what's best for themselves for the sake of the lost. Now let's kind of try to bring this to today and put some kind of local context on this and talk about what this means for us today. Depending on what surveys and what statistics you read, what we're told is that just in the United States alone, about 6,000 to 10,000 churches die and close their doors every year. Every year in the United States, about 6,000 to 10,000 churches die and close their doors every year. And here's the hard reality. The reason the majority of churches are dying is not because those churches are in communities that are dying. Right? The majority of churches that die are in communities that are growing, where the population is growing year after year after year. The reason that churches die is sometimes churches forget the why. They forget the mission, and when we forget the why, when we forget the mission, we stop being willing to sacrifice what's best for us for the sake of the lost. And so this plays itself out in so many ways. But I think one of the primary ways that's been talked about that this played out in the last several decades was in just kind of music style in the church. Like, I grew up in the church, and so as a teenager, it was kind of the height of what has been labeled the worship wars in church. Right? A lot of you lived through that whole thing. And so what that was for the longest time, church sounded a certain way. So for a lot of you, like growing up, you go to church and the sound that you hear is the organ and the piano and the choir. And if it's a really special occasion, they'll bust out the handbells, but it's got to be a big deal. Like, that's a really big Sunday. But understand, when the piano was introduced into the church, that was revolutionary. Right? You forget that because the piano was a bar instrument. And so when that first came into the church, they're like, no, you can't have a piano in church. No way. But a lot of people, they grew up where that was the way church sounded. The organ, the piano, the choir, all that. But then as more and more people within our community were listening to music that sounded completely different than how music sounded inside of the church, instead of saying, hey, what can we do to maintain the message? The songs we sing, they need to be true. They need to be biblical. They need to be Christ-exalting and Christ-honoring. So instead of saying, hey, how can we still sing those same timeless truths, but how can we sing them in a way that connects with people in our community? And instead of saying that and asking those questions, so many churches said, no, we're not changing. We're going to keep the style of music that we like, that we prefer. And man, as a teenager, that ticked me off so much. I didn't understand it. I didn't get that mentality. Because like all I could picture was like my friends from school who didn't believe in Jesus, who were like listening to punk rock like I did, and they weren't interested in coming to church because they would come to church and everything would just feel so completely irrelevant to them. They couldn't stand it. I'm like, man, like why can't you just give up this style of music for the sake of my lost friends? I didn't get it. It made me so mad. But can I be honest? Man, this is hard to admit. Like the older I get, man, now, dude, I get it. I totally get it. Because now, like, I'm set in my ways. Right? I like what I like. And now I don't want to change either. And so, honestly, like, I owe an apology to all those people that I judged so harshly back in the day because now I feel the exact same way that they did. And man, it's funny, there's scientific reasons behind this, actually. A friend of mine texted me a couple weeks ago this article. And the headline of this article was, here's why you don't discover new music past the age of 30. Right? If you're over 30, like, did you experience that? Like past 30, it's so cliche, but like, we're all like, man, they just don't make music like they used to anymore. Right? Like, here's the crazy thing. Every generation says that. Every generation thinks that. And again, there's a scientific reason why. It's because when you're young and you're going through adolescence, there is so much happening in your brain. And the chemicals are like flowing through your brain nonstop. And so as all that is happening, man, the chemical reactions in your brain at that age, when you hear new music, is so strong that that music is like locked in. But as your brain becomes fully developed, those chemical reactions aren't quite as strong anymore. And so as you age, you're not as open. You're not as receptive to new things like you were as your brain was still forming. Like for me in my late teens and early 20s, Coldplay was one of my favorite bands. Right? Their first two albums were great. And then their third album, X and Y, absolute masterpiece. Right? Like, it is a masterpiece. Like, no lie, I went to Walmart, I bought that album because I was driving to work that day. On the way to work, I bought the album, came back in, put the CD in my car, I had like an hour commute, listened to the entire album all the way through, got to work, called and said, hey, I'm having car problems, I'm going to be late, sat and listened to it all the way through again. Like, I'm not joking. It absolutely changed my world. Like, in terms of art, put it next to the Mona Lisa, put it next to David's Michelangelo. Like, it is a masterpiece. Absolutely brilliant. But then a couple years later, I got a little older. Their next album, it was okay. And then as I got even older than that, every album they put out since then, I'm like, this is garbage. I hate it. I haven't been able to listen to any of their albums since then. I've just given up on them. Now, here's the deal. Did Coldplay forget somehow how to write good music? Like, did Coldplay change? No. I changed. Like, my brain changed, and I am not receptive to those kind of things anymore. Right? This is why, for some of you, there are certain songs that you experience during a certain time in your life where, like, if we sing those songs in church, you have a completely different next level reaction emotionally than you do to a new song, don't you? Right? Like that's just the way it is. And so again, as I get older and I get it, I completely now understand this gravitational pull inside all of us. We've all got it. I understand this gravitational pull where we want comfort. We want familiar. We want what we know. We want the things that we've always liked. But here's the danger. Inside the church, when we do that, we're doing it at the expense of the mission and ultimately at the expense of the lost. listen, sacrificing what's best for us for the sake of the lost, it is hard to do. I'm not going to lie. It is so difficult to do, but it is always, always worth it. Check out this video real quick.
My two sons, Christopher and John, were brought up in the church. And that during that time, the church was at full capacity. We had always had the sanctuary, and the balcony was always full on most all Sundays. We had handbells. And then during Christmas and certain other special events, we'd put on these big productions. I do remember that if you were just a little bit late coming to church, one of the deacons would have to find you a seat and escort you there. I have seen many changes in Garden Oaks over the last 50 years. And I'm of the old school that I don't do change very well. I don't always relate to the music on Sunday mornings. And I think the drums are a little too loud. But I recently had the opportunity to visit another church service. And it was quite an eye-opener for me. It had all the things that I thought a church should have, but had very few people, mostly elderly, not too many young families. And as I left that church, I had this image of Garden Oaks. Those of us that have been here a long time, there's very few of us still left. And we look around the congregation and we see all these new faces, all these young families. The music, even though I don't always relate, I look over the congregation and I see the people swaying to the music and their arms lifted in worship. My thought at that moment was, my church is alive. It's growing, it's exciting, and I want to be part of that.
Amen. Hey, Miss Shirley, thank you for sharing that with us. We love you. So those of you who are new here, let me kind of give you some background and history real quick. This church has been here on this corner for 80 years. Like that's pretty amazing. And for the majority of that time, God was doing great things through this church. He was using this church to reach families and people in this community. I mean, like, one of the coolest experiences I've had in this pastor is like sitting in my office and thumbing through the baptism records of the past decades of this church. I mean, like literally hundreds and hundreds of names who either right here or over in the baptismal next door in the original sanctuary publicly declared faith in Jesus through the ministry of Garden Oaks. And just absolutely incredible move of God type of stuff. But then over recent decades, this community, this neighborhood started to change a little bit. And as that did, the natural inclination for all of us, right? We all have the natural inclination is for all of us to focus inwardly, focus on ourselves instead of focusing outwardly. And so again, just human nature is just to ask, hey, what do we prefer? What do we like? What's best for us? Instead of, hey, what does our changing community prefer? What does our changing community like? What's best for our changing community? And so the church started to decline as this inward focus, sort of what's best for us mentality set in. And as you saw in that video, in 2015, a consultant was brought in, and their conclusion, after kind of studying Garden Oaks Baptist Church, their conclusion was, if something doesn't happen, this church will be dead by 2025. But here's the thing. In 2020, something did happen. And by the way, if you're new, like, this has nothing to do with me. I wasn't even here yet. And this has to do with people like Miss Shirley and all those who were here in 2020. In 2020, the church commissioned a demographic study of this neighborhood to really seek to know and understand who the people were who were moving into this community, who was moving in to this neighborhood. And those of you who were here in 2020, you made the decision to say, hey, the people who are moving into our neighborhood, we will adopt them as our mission field. You made the choice of saying, hey, God has not placed us here in this neighborhood at this time in history by accident. We are here for a reason, and it is to reach the families who are moving into this community. And so those of you who are here in 2020, you said, hey, we will seek to do that. We will sacrifice what's best for us. We will lay down our needs. We will lay down our desires. We will lay down our preferences for the sake of the lost and the unchurched in our community. So listen, don't miss this. Like those of you who did that, that was like Antioch type of stuff. That was like New Testament, Book of Acts level stuff, where you made the incredibly difficult decision to say, because Jesus has given us this mission, we can't afford to make it about us. We can't afford to make it about what we like or what we prefer or what we want. We must remember the mission and make sacrifices for the sake of our community. Like what you did, guys. Like again, it is like New Testament type stuff. And everything that happens in the future of this church, like that's part of your legacy. That's part of the sacrifices that you have made because God has now chosen to honor those sacrifices that you have made. That is a big, big deal. And so, man, let me just say, like, I am so honored and I am so blessed that now as your pastor, like we come to a passage like this where we see this happening, we see this church sacrificing what's best for them for the sake of the mission and for the sake of the lost. I am so grateful that we get to a passage like this and I don't have to get up here and try to be like, come on guys, please, it matters, it's important, will you please do this? I can get up here and say, man, you are doing this, thank you so much, keep it up. Right? Like that's who you are as a church. You have been living and acting and behaving like the church of Antioch. That doesn't mean we're perfect. That doesn't mean we don't have issues. That doesn't mean we don't have things to work out and areas to grow in. But you're doing this. And that is amazing. Here's the thing. We've got to remember that making this choice, remembering the why, remembering the mission, and being willing to sacrifice for the sake of the lost in our community, we've got to remember it's not something that we just do one time and then move on. It's not a choice we just made back in 2020. This is a choice we have to continually, day by day, re-up on. We've got to continually make this choice. And again, I'm not going to lie to you. It's hard. It's really hard to do this. Man, like again, as I get older, if you're part of my generation, man, it's going to, and it's coming, we just got to be ready for it. It's going to be hard. It's going to be hard when like all the kids like, a generation or two down from me, they're like electric guitar and drums. Man, that's like 90s. Why are we doing that? Like, we need some electronic worship music. Man, they're going to have to pry the drums and electric guitar from my dead hands. I don't want to give that stuff up. It's going to be hard. But are we going to be willing to do that? Are we going to be willing to make those sacrifices for the sake of the lost? I remember what happens when you're in a small group, right? And you love the people in your small group, you've connected with them, but the small group grows and grows and it gets filled up and there's no room for new people. Like, hey, when that happens, are you going to be willing to make a sacrifice? Like, will you be willing to branch off from the small group that you've connected with and go to another one in order to make room for people who haven't met Jesus yet or people who haven't found deep, meaningful relationships yet? Like, making that sacrifice, like, that's hard, right? It's not an easy thing to do. Or like when we talk about giving and our financial stewardship, like it's hard to give financially. It's hard to give sacrificially, isn't it? To program sort of things that may be reaching people with the gospel, but that don't benefit us personally. It's hard to do that, isn't it? All of this is hard. But again, it's worth it. Remembering the mission and being willing to sacrifice what's best for us for the sake of those who don't yet know Jesus. It is so hard. It's hard for me. It's going to be hard for you. But again, it's worth it. And ultimately, remember what's happening in your heart and in my heart when we do that. When we do that, God is conforming us to look a little more like His Son Jesus. Right? Ultimately, at the end of the day, when we do this, it's not only good for the lost, it's good for us. When I say, hey, it's not about me, I will sacrifice what I like and what I want for the sake of those who don't yet know Christ. When I do that, I'm looking more like Christ. Because what did Christ do in order to seek us out when we were lost? He left His throne in heaven to come to earth. Was that convenient, you think? Absolutely not. And He lived a perfect life where He experienced all the pain, all the sorrow, all the loss, all the suffering that we do in this world. That was not good for Him. That was not convenient for Him. And ultimately, He voluntarily and willingly goes to the cross where He spreads His arm, He sacrifices His life for the forgiveness of our sin. That wasn't for His benefit, that was ours. He was laying Himself down for our sake. He was sacrificing what was best for Him for the sake of us when we were lost. And so when we make this choice, when we remember the mission, we say, because the mission of God is so important, and I'll lay down what's best for me. I'll lay down what I prefer. I'll lay down what I like for the sake of those who need the hope and the peace and the grace of God. When we do that, man, God is not only changing the world, He's changing us. He's changing our hearts, and we will start to look a little more and more like Jesus. Let's pray together.